Hey, what's up everybody? Matthew here. Thanks for checking into the channel. Today we're going to take an awesome tour into the past. We're going to be looking at one of the most influential Bibles that's ever been printed. Of course, I'm talking about the Protestant and even the Calvinistic Geneva Bible, which is the first Bible really to come here to America. We're going to tell the story about that. First, let me let you know you can actually get one of these. I've got one right here. It's been rebound with cords on the outside just to make it look extra cool. Also, depending on a couple of sources here today, looking at this book a little bit, a visual history of the English Bible, which I used for some of the research in this video. But I think you're going to find that the Geneva Bible is really one of the most significant historical Bibles of all time, if not one of the most important books that's ever been printed on the printing press. Now, you might say to yourself, well, the King James Version, the authorized version, is, of course, the greatest grandfather of all English translations. But as you're going to find in this video, the KJV does actually depend on the Geneva Bible to a certain extent. And so what I'd like to do in this video is take you through the history of the Geneva Bible. I think you're going to learn something. We're going to look at pages of it. We're going to look at its setting, its format, its features, and so forth. I think you're going to love it. If you're new to this channel, what's up? My name is Matthew Everhard. I'm one of the pastors here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a church like that, please come check us out. I'm also an adjunct professor at RPTS, the Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh, one of the best places that you can possibly do your Master of Divinity if you're looking to get ordained or if you want to study the Bible or Reformed theology. rpts.edu. Call them up, tell them that I sent you, that you saw it here on the Matthew Everhard YouTube channel. Okay, that all being said, let's go ahead and get into this. This is really an incredible edition of the Bible here, the Geneva Bible. Now, here's a look at a sample page, and this looks a lot like modern study Bibles. In fact, one of the things that we might say about this Bible is that to some degree, it is the precursor of all modern study Bibles as we now know them. I have a ton of study Bibles. I love them. I read them a lot. I use them, and this is really the first one. So let's look at a couple of its features here. First of all, we have book introductions here. This is the book introduction to the first book of Moses called Genesis. So we see here what they call the arguments of the author, which is the main presentation of the plot, the themes, the doctrine of that particular book. We're also going to see here the text of Scripture in two columns in verse-by-verse format, which is awesome. See here, we got verse 11, verse 12, verse 13, 14 set out. We have pilcros here indicating paragraph settings. So this is all like innovative stuff back in the day. We think of every Bible ever having chapters and verse numbers and so forth, but really this is a pretty new innovation, and you can see here that the printing of this Bible is absolutely extraordinary. In addition to this, what makes this one of the very first study Bibles that's ever been printed is that it has a ton of study information in the form of these sort of marginal study notes in two columns here on both the internal edge as well as the external edge. And as if that isn't enough, we also have very impressive woodcuts throughout the Bible. There's going to be maps, there's going to be other charts and things like that. I mean, honestly, it looks like something like the ESV Study Bible or the Reformation Study Bible or something really awesome like that. And then there's also some textual notes and some other marginalia down here. So that's what a sample page of the Geneva Study Bible looks like. So let's talk about its history here, and we're going to get into some of the details here. Now, this is an early Protestant Bible, and of course, that makes it distinct. And what's interesting about this is, we think that, for those who probably haven't studied this at all, that the King James Version is just the one. But we often forget that the King James Version is actually building on a tradition of other early English translations of the Bible. Now, as you know, and I know, the Bible was not written in English, okay? So the King James isn't the original Bible. I know some people might think that, but obviously the Bible was written in Hebrew with a few portions in Aramaic and then the New Testament written in Greek. Okay, so the Geneva Bible actually predates the King James Version, and this is the one that was used by both the Puritans, the English Puritans of the 1500s, as well as the early 1600s, and that would include the Pilgrims who brought the Geneva Bible on the Mayflower. We know that to be true to the Americas, and so the Geneva Bible is the first Bible to come to the Americas. It's also the first Bible with a real set of study notes. Now, you might imagine that study Bibles just go back as far as the Bible itself, but really that's not true. This is an innovation that the Geneva Bible brings as the printing press is really, really advancing and getting greater and greater. Of course, we might think of the printing press as something like an early 1500s advance, a major advance of human technology, and certainly that is true. But we've got to give the printing press a little bit of time to get more and more complicated with these kinds of extraordinary layouts. I personally can't even imagine how long it would take to lay out a Bible like this and to print it with all of the notes and all of the other features that the Geneva Bible has. That's why I'm saying this is really a true wonder of the printing world, much less a wonder of the theological world as well. This Bible went through something like 100 printed editions. Some sources that I looked at said as many as 200 editions. Basically what that means is every time they printed a bunch of them, they sold them or they sent them out and they got used up and taken and claimed. Sometimes, a book is printed in a big batch, like 1,000 or 10,000, and people don't buy it. They just sit in a warehouse somewhere or they get moldy and decayed. But every time they continue to print new Geneva Bibles, people bought them and used them. It truly was a wondrous force for the good, at least if you're like me and you're Protestant and probably Reformed in your theology as well. We think of this as a modern wonder of technological innovation. Now, here again is another picture of what the Geneva Bible looked like on the inside here. A little bit different from that Genesis chapter 1 page that we looked at earlier, but here we see a marvelous woodcut that's put into this. So all of these would be etched in wood and kind of designed in reverse in terms of artisticness, just cutting out pieces and then letting the top layers be your printing edge here. And you can see here that much of it is the text of the scriptures in the Geneva translation. We'll talk about the translation in a moment. And then always a running commentary of theological notes running down the sides, both on the internal column and the external column. Now, what can we say about the Geneva Bible and its origin? Well, first, this is the successor to the Great Bible of 1539, preceding then the authorized version of 1611. Now, interestingly enough, if you read the King James Version today, you know that it sounds somewhat antiquated, right? Because we have the these and the thous and verbs that end with eth and so forth. But some people think that the Geneva Bible actually sounds a little bit more modern than the King James Version, even though it predates it by several decades. And that is because the Geneva Bible, as it was translated into English, from the very get-go, they wanted this Bible to sound more like the speech of the common man, whereas the authorized version of 1611 did aim for slightly higher and even a more old-fashioned style of English renderings. And so that's why when you read the Geneva Bible, it actually sounds like it's later than the King James, but it's truly earlier than the King James Version. And this was no doubt a piece of Protestant evangelistic endeavor. Okay, although there's costs involved, obviously. You got to pay for the paper and the printing and the spine and all that kind of stuff, the woodcuts and so forth, but they intentionally wanted this to be affordable. They wanted average people to get this Bible. They wanted them to be able to buy it. They wanted the average working person to be able to buy this, using verse divisions to make it easier for expository preaching. So when you're preaching or teaching through the Word of God, you can tell your congregation where to look something up. Remember, older Bibles did not necessarily have chapter and verse divisions, especially when we go back to some of the manuscript, handwritten, hand-copied tradition there. And so this Bible was purposefully done to be affordable, readable, and portable. In other words, they made it in hand-size editions. A lot of books in those days were printed in rather large style, sort of like what we might think of a family Bible today. But they wanted this to be something that you could actually pack up and take in a bag and take to church and so forth. And as far as readability, they moved in this edition from that old style Gothic fonts. If you ever see a really old book, sometimes it's printed in letters and it's English, but you can't tell what it is. This was made in the newer style, Roman or Latin style fonts, which are very similar to the fonts that I'm using here in modern graphics like this PowerPoint presentation, okay? Things that are readable to the eye. Now here's another example of a Geneva Bible copy page here, or the front page. We see here the Roman style type, all bold, all caps here. We've got a bit of an italic kind of stylized font here. We will notice that some of the letters, like S's, look at this right here, look like an F to our eyes, but that's just the way that they used to print certain letters. So most of this is going to be very readable. The word epistle right here, it looks like epiphtal to our eyes, but once you start reading this, it gets pretty familiar to the eye that an F looks like an S. as we view it today. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the founding and the origin of the Geneva Bible, because this gets really interesting. You're going to recognize these names here, John Calvin and John Knox. I probably should have had Theodore Beza right here, so in your mind, put Beza underneath John Knox. These are something like the supervisors for this particular translation because they were actively involved in sort of an advisory role. But the actual work of the translation is this guy right here, William Whittingham, as well as some consultation with Coverdale, Goodman, Gilby, Sampson, and Cole. These would be other people who were actively involved in the Geneva Bible and its study notes. But Whittingham is really the main force here. And what's interesting is that he's actually related to John Calvin. I believe that they married sisters. Calvin's wife was the sister of Whittingham's wife, and so these guys are actually related. And so Calvin is something like the general advisor for the project, as well as Knox, who speaks English because he's Scottish, and Beza too. But Whittingham is your primary person here who's responsible for this entire project for the most part. Now, how did this come about? There's a little bit of history here. So remember, in England, there was a time where it kind of bounces back and forth between Catholic and Protestant monarchs. You have King Henry VIII, who's the first guy to sort of break away from Rome, not so much for theological reasons as he wants to be able to get a divorce, right? And then his son, Edward VI, is a Protestant, but he dies young, and so Mary takes the throne, and she's an ardent Catholic, so she's going to persecute the church. And then Elizabeth is going to be a little bit more of an establishment monarch. The Queen Elizabeth, kind of settles things down. But Bloody Mary right here, Mary Tudor, she is responsible for a serious period of persecution of early Protestant Christians because of her ardent, diehard Catholicism. So beginning in 1553, she's going to begin martyring, killing a number of the Protestants, including some 300 of her victims that were either burned or hanged or guillotined or whatever else they did. And so these people who were fleeing from England to go over to a safer haven were known as the Marian exiles. They're those who fled Bloody Mary to come to Switzerland under John Calvin and John Knox. So the Marian exiles come over here to Switzerland for a safe haven, and it's these Marian exiles who are primarily going to be responsible for the carrying out of this entire project, which is going to result in the Geneva Bible. Now let's talk a little bit more about some of the details here. So this is truly a translation. It's not just an updated English edition. So it's a real translation from the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. And the base text that it uses is, of course, the Textus Receptus, okay? So it's going to have the so-called missing verses that some people derogatorily say about the critical text, but we could talk about that in another video. In fact, we have. And in the Hebrew, it's going to use the Masoretic text, but it's also going to consult, for instance, Beza's 1555 edition of the Latin, and it is going to build off of Tyndale's English translation. And by the way, that's how most translations work. They start with a base text of the previous same language, previous edition, and then they rework it, but fully translating from the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek. And so if you think about, like, for instance, an English translation like the ESV, it doesn't just start from scratch. It builds upon the Revised Standard Version and so forth, going back to the American revision and then back to the King James and so forth. So most English translations stand in a tradition of translations that build upon the previous English iteration, but nevertheless working from the original text. Okay, so yes, again, this does have Roman letters, not Gothic, so it's easier to read. And it does use this advance of putting words not in the original in italics. Now, somebody who's never translated a paragraph in their entire life says, well, why would you put words in that are not in the original? Isn't that wrong? You're not supposed to add to the scriptures. Yes, obviously, we know that. But if you've ever translated something from one language to another language, you do sometimes have to add little words that just convey the full thought, especially when you have idioms or metaphors that don't necessarily translate word for word. To make it make sense in the receptor language, you do sometimes have to add something to a sentence to make it make sense. And so This does this in italics so that the reader knows that this has been supplied in order to make the rendering make complete sense. Now let's have a look here at a sample of the Geneva Bible, because you're probably going to think I'm reading from the King James. And again, these two translations are very analogous, the one to the other, the Geneva preceding the King James. But let's look here at the Lord's Prayer, which says in Matthew chapter 6, "Be ye not like them, therefore, for your Father knoweth whereof ye have need, before ye ask him. After this manner, therefore, pray ye, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, even in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen." So that probably sounds pretty familiar to you, especially if you're a King James reader. And we're going to notice here that these little indicators, these little letters here, E, F, G, and H, these are going to take us down to the theological notes here. And so if we were to look to the bottom of the page or to the marginalia, we'd have these sorts of comments. So note E says, "Long prayers are not condemned, but vain, needless, and superstitious." Okay. F note says, "A true sum and form of all Christian prayers." In other words, commending the Lord's Prayer as an example prayer. G note says, that is meat for our nature, for our daily food, or such as may suffice for our nature and complexion. And note H says, "From the devil," or from all adversity. So these are just little comments. You notice they're not too terribly long. It's not like you have a ton of comment here, like full pages or paragraphs, although there are places in the Geneva Bible that have extended notes. For instance, when I look at the book of Revelation, some of the notes here are very, very, very long. For instance, you probably can't see this. Well, let's see if we can do this right here. Let's switch back to this mode. I don't know if you can see this, but all of this is a long note on Revelation chapter 13. So there are certain times where you have really, really long notes. And part of my study also indicated that the notes of Revelation were actually switched out in subsequent editions of the Geneva Bible. They later put a new version of notes on Revelation that they thought were more helpful than the previous version of notes. Now, a little bit about some printings here. We have some octavo editions, which would be 9.6 by 6.5. This is your basic study Bible size that we have today. Quarto is a little bit smaller. That'd be like a thin line size, 8.5 by 5.5. Most books, by the way, are still kind of in the 9.6 by 8.5 region. So we're talking about easily portable, carryable books, just like we have today. And although there were over 150 editions, some of the most important ones, 1560, 1575, first time they were free to print it in England. 1579, it gets printed in Scotland. 1599 is kind of the major standard edition that most people would refer to. Interestingly enough, though, after it was banned, printing this Bible was banned, and we think it was printed as late as 1625, but they would use the 1599 date kind of deceptively to say, we got this one in before it was banned. But probably it was being printed much longer than that. In fact, there's at least one article that I read that suggested that it printed as late as 1644. So still using that kind of more dubious 1599 date back when it was legal. So let's talk about those theological notes here for just a moment. I mentioned they're Calvinistic. Now, obviously it's going to be Calvinistic because the project was overseen by John Calvin and Beza and John Knox. So Calvinistic as distinct from what? Well, as distinct from Lutheran or Anglican or Catholic notes. The Reformed movement being, of course, present in Geneva, Switzerland, but also in places like Belgium, the Netherlands, and certainly Scotland. But English Calvinists who were set to reform the Church of England, we tend to call Puritans. And as far as the notes go, though they're Calvinistic and Puritan in their orientation, like myself, so I'm perfectly fine with the notes in this study Bible, they take a historicist version or understanding of the book of Revelation, meaning that they thought the Revelation was essentially an ongoing description of historical events, rather than like an idealistic view, which I would actually hold closer to an idealistic view of Revelation. The notes are anti-Catholic. Okay, so if you're a Roman Catholic, you're not going to like the study notes here. They distinctly call the Pope the Antichrist in certain places, including Revelation 13. And some people would say, and they did say, that the notes were too tough on kings. And this is why King James in 1611 wants a different translation. He's actually disturbed by the popularity of the Geneva Bible, the Geneva Study Notes, because he thinks they're anti-monarchical, meaning that they're too tough on kings. And of course, he's a king, so he wants better notes. And so what they do is they say, all right, no notes at all in the King James. The King James is not going to have any study notes. And that was one of the agreements at the Hampton Court for even convening the new translation committee that would do the King James. James did not want the Geneva Bible study notes. He thought they were too Puritan and not in support of his kingly authority enough. The theological notes do also mention textual variants, which is awesome because they were aware of the fact that different handwritten manuscript copies had some variations, and so they make that known. Very similar to what the New King James Version does today, which I think is the best. The New King James has some of the best textual variant notes. But the Study Bible also includes maps and helpfully difficult words explained. Again, the idea here being that they wanted common, everyday, ordinary people to be able to understand their Bibles. So they do that. Here's just another page. We can see a couple of more of these woodcuts here, which are very impressive, I think, as well as some of the study notes. The text here and then the study notes on the side. Again, it's a work of wonder, and it's really impressive because, you know, it's not easy to design a layout of a book to make it look beautiful and attractive. People that don't know anything about book design and layouts and fonts and styles, they think it's easy. You just start throwing stuff on the page. Well, no, it's actually really, really hard, and especially when you're working with a printing press. If you think it's hard to just design an attractive PDF or something like that where you can move stuff all around the page, imagine trying to do that in a typeset where you're actually putting these metal words and prints and letters and woodcuts onto basically a form which adheres it and then stamps it onto a page. I mean, it's just a technological work of wonder as far as I'm concerned. Here's another sample page here. Looks like the beginning of Isaiah as far as I can tell. Always these little beautiful chapter beginnings here. And just the design of this book just looks really beautiful to my eye. Here is a painting of them bringing the Bible to America. This ostensibly is the Mayflower or some other early ship coming here to the Americas. And what do we see here right in the center? The visual center of this painting is the Bible, and this would be the Geneva Bible that they're bringing over. We see, of course, this beautiful rainbow here symbolizing the Bible's promise in the book of Genesis of the covenant, the Noahic covenant, and so forth. And this scene conveys something like a pious but optimistic, devoted view of the Puritans coming to the New World to establish Christendom and to be able to worship God freely without the kinds of persecutions that they faced in Europe. Now, as we come then to the end of the era, we do remember, of course, that the Geneva Bible is eventually going to be replaced by the King James Version, and especially because of James's insistence that his version, his new translation, have no notes. Again, he doesn't want there to be opportunities to argue or especially to undercut his particular authority. But interestingly enough, you know, our King James Version friends who really love the KJV, some that even describe themselves as KJVO, or King James Version only, they often forget that even the King James itself depended upon previous translations. Some King James only people will tell you that the King James can never be improved, and basically that's, you know, updating a version is just anathema. But they forget that the King James Version itself was an updated edition which depended heavily upon the Geneva Bible and the Great Bible and so forth. Eventually, printing of the Geneva Bible was banned, and I already mentioned to you Robert Baker's illegal 1559 editions, which is just kind of cool that he's like, yeah, we can't print them anymore, so we just kind of kept the date the same and basically said, yeah, these were, you know, they've been around. One thing that I thought was interesting is that later on, a few King James versions are going to use the new authorized version text, but continue to incorporate the Geneva Bible study notes, even as the King James Version is replacing the Geneva Bible. So that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty neat. And if you're wondering all along how you can get a hold of a Geneva Bible, you still can get this Bible today. There's a couple different ways to do it. The one that I held up is this one right here, the 1559 Geneva Bible done by Tale Lege Press, which is not a real well-known publisher. But if you can get a hold of one of these, the edition really is excellent. The paper is great. It's totally readable. Let me just show you this again. It looks similar to the Geneva Bible that I showed you, although this completely has been reset and updated. But if you don't want it to be reset and updated, then get this one right here, done by Hendrickson Press, which this one actually, let's see here. This one actually does look like the original one, I'm pretty sure. So buyer beware. This one is going to look more readable to your eye for the most part. This one is going to look more like it used to look. So pick your poison there, okay? Might be the best way for you to actually read the Geneva Bible, though, would be to go on and get it like as an app, or perhaps get it as a Kindle ebook for your reader. And there are a bunch of different versions of it on Amazon. There's a bunch of them, actually. Doesn't really matter to me which one you get. But places like Bible Gateway have the Geneva Bible. You can actually use that. So let's open up Bible Gateway. And no, we don't want a free plan or anything like that. Yeah, you can actually type in your passage and you can actually use the Geneva Bible even today. So it is available to you on modern websites like that. Okay, so I'll post a link to these ones in the description of this video if you want to grab them there. But that's it for our lesson today. I hope you appreciated that. The Geneva Bible, a work of wonder and one of the most important Bibles the world has ever seen. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots. Talk to you later.